So welcome and good evening. We're glad you're here for part one of our Midweek Connections. And we have with us this evening Dr. Rick Elgendy, and he's at Wesley Theological Seminary. He is the Associate Professor of Christian Ethics and Public Theology. His research and his teaching are animated by asking questions about the self, spirituality, politics, at the intersection of political theology, systematic theology, and critical theory. And so tonight he is going to help us grapple with the topic of publicly available, why and how Christian faith is political.
Thanks so much, Noelle. It's great to be with you all tonight, and thanks for this invitation to join you. I've been teaching public theology at Wesley for 7 years now, and so what I'm bringing you tonight is some of the lessons I've taken from my teaching and research in thinking, particularly for those of us who are white Christians, about how our faith has been formed and often deformed in terms of how it engages the political and social worlds. I've prepared a PowerPoint slideshow. My multimedia skills are, I would describe them as very 2003. So the production value on this is generously described as low. However, this is going to allow me to have something to leave you with. I'll be providing a PDF version of this for you all to circulate. And it will serve as a kind of open script for us as we progress through what I've prepared for our conversation tonight. As Noelle mentioned, there are a couple of logical stopping points in the course of this presentation, but you're nevertheless welcome to interrupt me at any point to pause and explain more, or to slow down, or to speed up. And all of that is great. I just want to say off the bat, I've done this sort of presentation with a number of churches, and rarely has a staff been so adamant that a community was ready for the advanced course. So this is an action-packed presentation. There's a lot there. If some of it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, or if some of it moves too quickly, that's okay. I'm happy to revisit whatever we've just discussed. But I'm also going to give you some key takeaways from every section. And if you can follow those bolded points, in my opinion, you're doing pretty well. You're also welcome, by the way, just to call me Rick. So please, as you address me, you're welcome to do that. Let's begin, shall we? So publicly available, why and how Christian faith is political. Oops. In this week's session, I hope to point towards some of the fault lines in the theological and political traditions that we inherit. I argue that this analysis suggests recasting our political theological imaginations around suppressed terms, socially marginalized people, and a project of reintegrating what many of our, especially white and European, habits of mind and heart have split apart. So a major theme here is going to be reintegration. And I think that's nicely depicted, nicely symbolized by that photograph of the counter-protests in Charlottesville in 2017. White Protestants inherit a tradition that divides body from soul, religion from politics, order from justice, and more. How is Christian faith political in ways that we have missed or obscured? How does a more integrated, in every sense, theological imagination reorient us toward the political world? And how can we think about policy debates in light of a deeper account of the purpose of our life together? So those are the guiding questions. And I'm going to explore those through three pairs of terms, how we've understood them, and I'm going to argue misunderstood them in most of our sort of recorded history. So here's one slide of preface, a deeper unity, reconfiguring our political theologies. We inherit a tradition that puts social goods or dimensions of human life in tension or competition with each other. This isn't wrong as such. There are genuine antagonisms in history, or else Christ's injunction to love one's enemies would make no sense. But there are also forms of tension or competition that come from a distorted understanding of human life, the human person, or the fact of our interrelationships. What follows are three instances. These instances aren't exhaustive, but I argue that they operate in distinctively crucial ways. And this is going to structure the rest of what follows. They are religion and politics, public and private, and order and justice. So there's going to be a section on each of those pairs: religion and politics, public and private, and order and justice. Now, I want to say this important caveat from the beginning. I don't think these tensions are resolvable by appeal to a simple both and, as if a simple affirmation of plurality will suffice to solve our problems. We, especially, I think, progressive Christians, are really good at remembering to challenge an either or with a both and that's useful. But there are a number of tensions, a number of divisions that can't simply be overcome that way. Instead, I argue that we need to reorient our imagination so that we see the mutual implications of these goods or categories, often undoing the beliefs or actions that led to a split. We'll also briefly discuss a policy issue subject to live conversation in 2020 under each category and how it may look different, so transformed. That probably sounds pretty abstract for now, but keep in mind, what I want you to keep in mind there is that you can't just affirm both sides and assume that you've solved the conceptual, indeed the spiritual problem posed by each of these tensions. Religion and politics, the two kingdoms. This may well be familiar to you. This is a system developed by Martin Luther. Its foundations have its root in his treatise, The Freedom of the Christian, but he also wrote a number of documents on temporal authority. According to Martin Luther, God rules the world, all of it, in two ways. On the left, you have the worldly kingdom, the left-hand kingdom. That's the realm of the outer person. It's governed by modest reason. It involves the use of force, coercion, law, and perhaps violence. It's meant to establish and preserve order by restraining sin. And we're going to come back to that theme of order in the third theme. And it includes the institutional aspects of the church. So the church also belongs to the left-hand kingdom. This is more or less the realm of the body, of history, society, of the public, of the political. All of those things are governed by God, but they're governed sinisterly, to use the literal meaning of that term. They're governed by God's left hand, meaning that there's an indirection to God's interventions in that dimension of our existence. The heavenly kingdom is what Luther calls the right-hand kingdom. That's the realm of the inner person, conscience, or spirit, or soul. There we respond in faith alone. Reason has no place in that kingdom. Citizenship must be given by God. It can't be compelled by any creature. And it's meant to redeem and reestablish communion with God. It includes the communion of saints that dwells within the church. But it's not about the institutional aspects of the church. Now, you can overstate the influence of this, but I think that this is at the heart of a lot of our political and theological thorny issues. When we're thinking about why faith is political, I think a lot of it comes from the division of the Christian person, who's down there on both sides of that line. It comes from that division being kind of naturalized, being made a basic part of who we are and who we're called to be. This means, for instance, that gospel values like the Sermon on the Mount don't apply to the worldly kingdom. Martin Luther had a very aggressive position on what sorts of violent coercion, including in war, were permissible for Christians, including Christian soldiers and Christian leaders. This is one of the key moments in European thought of thinking that we can separate religion and politics as if they are two sort of simply distinct spheres of human life. The people of the New Testament era and the authors and editors of the New Testament are perfectly aware that there's a distinction between God and Caesar. They're not aware that there are two dimensions of life called religion and politics, in which we are sort of fundamentally different or fundamentally divided people. So that is causing, I think, a lot of trickiness, including here we're talking about how it's a political distinction. Much more on that provocative photo in a moment. Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists, you might be familiar with this as one of the key originating documents in the American legal tradition of separation of church and state. It's a very short document. It's one of my favorite readings to assign because the students love the fact that it's just 2 paragraphs. But the position there is that the legitimate interests of the state reach actions only and not opinions, which is the foundation for the wall of separation between church and state. And that's representative of how Jefferson and the American legal tradition appropriates something from Luther. They may not understand themselves to be doing so, but this idea that you can divide between a properly public sphere of history, society, politics, and action, and opinions, the inner life of opinions, conscience, faith, and soul. So that's sort of embodied in a lot of our social institutions. But I want to push against that problem. This distinction, the distinction between religion and politics, is itself political. There is good reason to doubt the story the modern nation state tells about its origins, as savior from religious violence, as neutral arbiter of social conflicts rather than party to them, as steward of the common good. It's not clear that the nation state dwells in a realm of pure secular politics, whereas religion dwells in this sphere of intense personality. It bears a violent, zealous force that has to be corralled, so on and so forth. And one of the places you can see that lack of clarity is in this concept of civil religion that makes sense of that image of the apotheosis of Abraham Lincoln. In addition to holding suspicion about the non-political character of faith, one might be deeply skeptical of the secular character of the state. This concept of civil religion comes from a sociologist named Robert Bellah and his 1967 article, Civil Religion in America. Civil religion is a symbolic system that uses God in connection with the nation rather than the church, natural law and rights rather than specifically Christian discipleship, American history rather than salvation history, and so on and so forth. A lot of the time people ask questions about, like when politicians invoke God bless America, or when we talk about adding the words under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, or in God we trust to our money. People talk about how that's a kind of religious incursion into politics. The concept of civil religion lets us ask, wait, which God are we talking about? Who's God? Is that the God that is pointed to by Jesus of Nazareth, and the one whose reign is witnessed in the New Testament witness? Or is that a different God? After all, the word God just has its roots in a meaning, the one who is invoked. Who is being invoked when practitioners of the civil religion use that word? It may well be the case, so a perspective animated by this concept of civil religion would ask. It may well be the case that the civil religion is trying to form you as an American citizen, trying to give you a certain particularly religious attachment to the political community and ultimately to the nation state in order to mobilize you for its purposes. It is worth asking, and I don't know that we all answer these questions in the same way, but are you willing to kill or be killed for your country? Are you willing to kill or be killed for your faith? Are you willing to kill or be killed by other members of your faith for the purposes of your country? And I think in the asking of those questions, we can start to drive just a little bit of a wedge into this idea that the political world is somehow innocent of religion. One last slide on religion and politics. This is from William Cavanaugh's chapter, Killing for the Telephone Company, from Migrations of the Holy. By the way, I was asked to provide you all a bibliography, and so I'm being careful to give you fuller citations of my sources here so that you can use my sources from the slideshow to do some further investigation if you'd like. Kavanaugh writes, "The urgent task of the church is to demystify the nation state and to treat it like the telephone company. At its best, the nation state may provide goods and services that contribute to a certain limited order. Mail delivery, for example, is a positive good. That's a poignant example in 2020. The state is not the keeper of the common good, however, and we need to adjust our expectations accordingly. The church must break its imagination out of captivity to the nation state." In other words, this division between religion and politics serves the purposes of a particular political imagination. Here's my provocation. If you take one thing from what I've said about this pair, religion and politics, it's this. The distinction between religion and politics is itself a political distinction, serving the interests of the state and those best served by it. To deny this division is neither to call for theocracy nor for religious uniformity. Rather, it is a call to mobilize the fullness of faith and invite suspicion of the nation state. So if someone is telling you to keep your religion non-political or apolitical or private, it is well worth asking on what grounds they want you to do that, whose interests it's serving, and what they mean by religion and politics. Neither of those terms are ancient or obvious. The policy issue I want to mention in passing is the executive order from last month on the teaching of patriotic history, forbidding government departments and contractors from engaging with critical race theory. You might ask why it is that critical race theory as an academic discipline that wasn't in the headlines all the time before 2020 is seen as such a great threat. Well, I think it's transparently the case. I don't think this is a very controversial statement to say that it's a threat to the legitimation of the current structures of the state posed by, for instance, the 1619 Project, an engaged project by the New York Times and editor Nicole Hannah-Jones to undermine the stories the state tells to engender attachment to it. Why is it that the nation state needs us to believe a certain history? Why is it that some interests see that they're invested in that kind of patriotism? Well, I think one way of getting an answer to that is asking real questions about the ways that our politics just are religious. So they told me that y'all were familiar with arguments about how our faith is political, but I think that actually works both ways. And that's a suggestion that this division between religion and politics is itself a political distinction. You know, I was doing this interesting exercise conversation with someone the other day, and I was prompted to recite something that I knew by heart. And to my dismay, what came to mind was not like my favorite poem or my favorite moment from scripture, but the Pledge of Allegiance. And that was so telling to me just about myself, because that was so drilled into me through my public school education that even now at some later date in my life, I can do that by heart even faster than I can do things that I think that I care about more. And I think it's really worth asking why it is that our social structures are so invested in like generating that allegiance. And I think that executive order and the controversy there, that's really telling. Why does someone who's president of the United States, why do the powerful care about critical race theory sort of workshops? I mean, maybe they're right to, specifically because it cuts at this root of engendering a certain kind of attachment. So I'm uncomfortable with it too, and I'm uncomfortable with its effects in my own life. You know, I'm perfectly happy to tell you up front that I'm left-leaning politically, but I think one of the problems we have on the political left is that we don't often interrogate very well the purposes and features of the nation state. We tend to think that government is the solution to problems of social power and economics, and we might be right about that. But we also need a sort of fuller picture of how the state is invested socially and what the church can do differently. I mean, what we can do aside from the mechanisms of power, the levers of power. I think that's a really useful question to ask. Yeah, it's very tricky. Here's what I'd say. I'm not going to answer that question directly because I don't think I should answer it for everyone. But I would say if you put it in the sanctuary, you're saying that it's an object of devotion. And if you are making the US flag an object of devotion, I think you should ask some questions about how that's forming you and what you are hoping to accomplish by including it in your sort of symbology of faith objects. I'm suspicious of it. I prefer not to have it in a sanctuary if I'm going to church in a place. I don't know that it's irresponsible as such. I don't want to legislate that for everyone. But I do think that we do it. I think the churches who do it too quickly and without asking the right sorts of questions. I think that's absolutely right. I think the contest over the interpretation of history, because history is never just about the past. That contest is about contests among us right now. And I think that efforts to, I mean, the point isn't always to prefer versions of history that paint America in a bad light. That's not the norm. But it's to tell a more honest story that has a more complicated relationship to who we are and our, you know, our legacies as a political community. I think that's really important. Shall we, let's keep going. Let's get some more on the table. And we're not going to be leaving any of these issues behind. I promise you that. Okay, so after religion and politics, the next one is public and private. One of the great slogans of second wave feminism, the personal is the political, is particularly relevant here. And that's not an accident. The distinction between public and private has often been used in histories descended from Europe to divide between characteristically masculine and feminine spheres of life. That's not just theological, that goes back to ancient Rome as well. So that's why I'm sort of generally speaking about Europe there. Certainly Christian ways of thinking and social organizing are involved in this too. That distinction between public and private is not innocent. Power and resources tend to accrue to dimensions of life seen as masculine. This is from social theorist Nancy Fraser and her chapter, Sex, Lies in the Public Sphere, Reflections on the Confirmation of Clarence Thomas, from this book, Justus Interruptus. This struggle, the confirmation hearing, raised in a dramatic and pointed way key questions about the nature of contemporary publicity. It was not simply a battle for public opinion within an already constituted public sphere. What was at stake was, on the contrary, the very meaning and boundaries of publicity. Were Anita Hill's accusations the airing of private grievance in what was properly a public forum? Well, a lot of people in Clarence Thomas's defense invoked privacy as a way of saying that those concerns don't bear in this forum. What Nancy Fraser is arguing is that that struggle shows that the standard liberal view, and here we mean liberal like liberal democracy, of public and private is not self-evident, but implemented in practice when we sort some people's concerns into categories of public relevance or domesticity. John Dewey famously said that the first task of a public is to discover itself. That part of the work of the public is to constitute itself as a public. But that's not a self-evident, I mean, in the way he describes that as work, he's telling you that it's not self-evident, it's not natural what sorts of topics of conversation, what sorts of styles of reasoning are public rather than private. This has an analog, to use Fraser's terms here, in dividing productive from reproductive labor. Productive labor is paid labor. It's seen as contributing something to the economy. And reproductive labor is all the labor, not just childbirth and rearing, but all that it takes to sustain human life outside of the labor that we think of as productive. And obviously, you know that in our society, productive labor is associated with masculine roles and reproductive labor with feminine roles. Much more on that in a moment. But this distinction between public and private lines up with a couple of other paired terms, the marked and unmarked, and particular and universal. Here's what I want to say about those things. A widespread feature of social identity was described this way by linguist and theorist Roman Jakobson. A marked term or form is visible or stands out in relation to a more common or assumed and usually dominant unmarked term or form. So the marked first. The marked announces the existence of A, which is just some meaning or quality. It suggests some deviation from an assumed norm, and for that reason, it is visible. Think of the ethnic foods aisle in many supermarkets. Some supermarkets are getting better about this. They're labeling things a little more clearly, for one. But the idea of making certain foods visible as particularly ethnic works in reverse to sort of naturalize, to de-ethnicize usual foods, things we take for granted as American foods, right? They are made usual foods by virtue of this contrast with the ethnic foods, the other foods. And the point there is just to say that in that sort of naming of ethnicity, they are marked. The unmarked does not announce the existence of A, sometimes even concealing it. What is unmarked is seen as normal, the default, common, not particular, etc. Think of the way whiteness obscures itself in questions of race, as if people of color have particular perspectives, and white people speak generally or neutrally or objectively. People who say things like, let's be dispassionate about this, or let's be objective, as if their unmarked identity, which in conversations about race is whiteness, isn't a particular itself. So the marked and unmarked divide there works to reinforce, it works in parallel with the public and the private. The unmarked is seen as sort of particularly public, whereas some people's concerns are particular, visible, marked, and not universal. So viewing some subjects as private or particular, or some identities in the same way, tends to obscure our common implication in dynamics of race, gender, sexuality, class, etc., and tends to elevate certain interests, styles of thinking, and identities to a universal norm. The idea there being that particulars like whiteness, like maleness, pass themselves off as universal by virtue of their going sort of unmarked, unnamed. And that's why I keep insisting on using the names of things, that we inherit a theological tradition that's largely a white tradition, and that it comes with certain particular attachments and certain particular habits of mind as a result. That's an image of the book by Katrine Marshall, Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? The answer is his mom. Provocation. So that's a lot again. If you take one thing about public and private, here's what I want you to take. The distinction between public and private frequently serves to render invisible and natural structures of domination, particularly by removing certain sets of issues from public view. This may work by fueling the perception that some subjects should be removed from public conversation. Think of the effort expended by the Me Too movement to force a conversation about a longstanding and serious, really, set of issues. Why was that effort necessary? It's because certain kinds of issues, sexual violence, are privatized. They're made sort of not the subject of respectable public conversation. They're sort of dismissed as gossip. It may also work by restraining our imagination in terms of public solutions to problems, returning them instead to private responsibility. And we do that especially in terms of economics. And so I wanted to point to this policy instance, the impact of the pandemic on women in the workforce, since women are often default caregivers domestically, a whole ton of scare quotes there as well. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported last month that roughly 617,000 women dropped out of the workforce compared to 78,000 men. The idea there being that this invokes, again, Fraser's distinction between productive and reproductive labor, that there are certain kinds of labor we don't value, even though they are entirely socially necessary, because they're associated with the feminine. And that has meant, just as a matter of fact, that as the circumstances of the pandemic have worn on, there's been this huge effect on the livelihoods, the careers, and the well-beings of women relative to men. No one's doing well, but there is a particular burden imposed on women by the fact that they are seen as the private caregivers. The realm of the domestic is their sphere. And you should listen to other people rather than me for a really in-depth exploration of that. But it seems to me that one of the things working to reinforce that is this distinction between public and private. And I was also taught, if only by silence, not to think of race as an issue for me. Race was an issue for them, right? So when they raise the issue of race, you know, what do I have to do with, like, what have I done, right? And that's a way that marked and unmarked, that I'm seeing my racial identity as universal and someone else's particular is making a demand. And it's important, I think what white fragility and many of the other conversations thinking about anti-racism these days, what's important about them is taking a first step at least to name, like, everyone's identity is particular. Everyone is formed racially and in terms of gender and otherwise. We're all formed in particular ways. And that's not a problem. It's just a fact of human existence first, right? And then we, like, from that ground where we understand that that's a public issue that we're all implicated in, then we can have a productive conversation about it. I think that's really the usefulness of that. But it gets to how many of us aren't very well formed in that respect. We make a political choice every day that we accept a system where, by default, women are just in charge of the household, whether or not they have a career, you know, whether or not they have other caregiving responsibilities, whether or not, you know, men are benefiting from that. That's a political issue. And I think that, just like I said, the distinction between religion and politics is a political distinction. The distinction between public and private is politically invested. That is right on. That's a public-private, that's a moment in which public and private is being reconstituted. And there are always fights about hair, specifically about Black folks' hair in the workplace, including the football field workplace, I guess. And a number of states will still allow employers to fire or reprimand employees for having unprofessional hair, which is always marked. Let's move on to order and justice. We're 3/4 of the way done. So there's the frontispiece from Hobbes' Leviathan, which I invoke because in the traditions we inherit, the great threat, social and natural, is chaos, the instability and unpredictability of a world that was in rebellion against God. The war of all against all, the violence of nature, the collapse of social orders, all of which might spell the end of flourishing human life for a generation, have felt like ever-present possibilities in this tradition. Here's a quotation from Calvin. I'm sure you're all good Calvinists. From his commentary on Psalm 104. Certainly no banks and even no iron gates could make the waters, which in their own nature are fluid and unstable, keep together and in one place, as we see to be the case. He then cites earthquakes and floods that devastate human communities. By an instance of this kind, we are warned what would be the consequence were the restraint imposed upon the sea by the hand of God removed. How is it that we have not thereby been swallowed up together but because God has held in that outrageous element by his word. So for Calvin, the natural world tends toward chaos. And if not for the moment-to-moment intervention of God to preserve order in the face of that, human life wouldn't be possible. We wouldn't survive, let alone sort of thrive in the ways that are particular to humanity. The social world for Calvin operates by the same principles. There is a natural tendency in a fallen world toward chaos and disorder. And the purpose of government is to establish order, not to save humanity, not to establish justice, but rather to restrain the effects of sin. Calvin also believes that civil law has a sort of pedagogical function. To some extent, there's a soul craft element in participation in society. But really, the primary purpose of government for Calvin, as it was for Luther, as it is for many Protestant theologians up and down the line, is to preserve order. And they insist, Luther even has a treatise called Against Insurrection that insists this very loudly against the Peasants' Revolt in the 1520s. They insist that it is not worth gambling a stable social order to achieve an increase of justice. That takes us to the next slide. Where is disorder? As you know, liberation theologies that take on an explicit norm against structures of domination, object to that line of argument on behalf of justice. This is a good and right objection, but the white Protestant tradition knows that injustice in society exists. It just has a severe prejudice in favor of preserving order. So again, here's that problem of why the both and doesn't go deep enough. That the Luthers and Calvins of the world, when it comes to the preference for order, they understand that social orders are unjust. They just value order more highly. I think it's useful that liberation theologians have an even deeper argument. So here's the problem. The attempt to have order without justice fails on its own terms, because you cannot have a genuine order without justice, only institutionalized disorder. Former mayor of Chicago, my hometown, Richard J. Daley, said in 1968, appropriately enough, the policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman is there to preserve disorder. Now that was a Freudian slip. That's not what he meant to say, but that illustrates this point nicely. Police killings of people of color, for instance, show that the structures of our society routinize, normalize, officialize violent disorder. There are many ways that the current moment's dislocations are unique and extraordinary. There are many other ways in which these dislocations are salient because they are more widely shared outside of oppressed communities. In other words, you'll hear from a lot of people who are advocates for the poor, who are advocates for people who are racially othered, that the argument that we need to get back to normal isn't good enough because normal was horrifying in many ways. Normal, quote unquote, represented order without justice, which was a normalized disorder. One of the ways that liberation theology is going to challenge this is through an idea that's sometimes called the sacrament of the neighbor. That God is somehow present in the neighbor, particularly the neighbor at the social margins, as the visible means of an invisible grace. For James Cone, this means that God is black, meaning that God is not colorblind, but rather dwells among the oppressed in society. That's not a statement about God's skin color, it's a statement of where God's heart is. And for the Christian who would be converted, for the Christian who would be loyal to God, how one's heart is meant to be aligned in the world. For Latin American liberation theologians, this means that God is among the crucified people. And they talked often about the crucified Christ in relation to the vast and dehumanizing poverty of much of Latin America, originally in the 60s. You may know about the Medellin Conference in Colombia, where liberation theology bishops met in 1968, but up through today in many respects as well. This means that the question of justice for Christians is not so much about deliberation that evaluates ethical goods, but rather identifying the location of the center and source of the true, the good, and the beautiful. The question is not how much of my power and privilege can I retain, but how close can I get to that divine presence? The point is not just that God commands justice. Yes, of course. The point is that God is among the oppressed, that God dwells on the social margins. And so the question for us, if God is really our center of gravity, the question for us is how we can be in a deeper communion with that God. Not like, how close do I have to get, right? How close am I morally obliged to get? But how can I move my own center of gravity toward that location? So the provocation here is that order, including its embodiment in law, should be subordinate to justice in our political imagination. We should rigorously examine our advocacy for where disorder masquerading as order is working as a default, using claims about looting to distract from the messages and aims of protests, for instance. I bet you saw that a lot over the course of the last 6 months. And the policy instance there is contemporary conversations about prison and police defunding or abolition. There can be no doubt that our current order depends on police and prisons, and many of us are attached to the stability and security it seems to provide. But that may be because we've been largely isolated from these institutions' forms of disorder and their deadly consequences. Now, I think there's a legitimate debate between substantial reform and things like abolition. I'm not trying to stack the deck here. But my point is that you see this dynamic of order and justice, of what kind of justice is achievable at what cost for order in that debate. And if we're going to take this argument from our theological siblings seriously, I think we need to recast how we understand the relationship between those two things.